So my name is Deirdre Malloy from Dublin City Council Culture Company, and our speaker today is the wonderful Dr. Mary McAuliffe. Mary is an assistant professor on gender studies at UCD and holds a PhD from the School of History and Humanities in Trinity College, Dublin. So Mary specialises in women's and gender history, and she's the co-author of We Were There, 77 Women of the Easter Rising, Four Courts 2016, and co-editor of Kerry 1916, Histories and Legacies of the Easter Rising, which is a IHP 2016, and a biography of the revolutionary women, Margaret Skinnider, UCD Press 2020. She's also published on several aspects of Irish women's history on gender, violence and war, memory, commemoration and history, social and political history, and the histories of sexualities. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand you over to Mary.
Thank you very much, Deirdre, and it's great to be talking to you as part of the Dublin Festival of History. And if you don't mind now, I shall share the screen and get started on the talk. What I'm talking about today is Republican surveillance and punishment of women during the War of Independence. And this is a very important aspect of the war that we need to look at, but also one that has been relatively underwritten in recent years. A lot of people are beginning to do research on the gendered and sexual violence against women, but we have to realize that it came from both sides in the War of Independence and indeed on into the Civil War. But what I want to look at today is the type of surveillance that women endured, particularly by the Republican side, but also referencing the Crown War side, and how intense that actually was during this period. So on July 9, 1921, a dispatch from the officer commanding of the West Clare Brigade of the IRA sent a memo to the Director of Intelligence in the IRA GHQ in Dublin discussing the case of Bridie Burke. Bridie, according to the OC, had come home to Kilrush on holidays, and I got her detained. I intend keeping her under arrest, he said, until I hear from you. Let me have a reply by return. GHQ would have been aware of who Bridie Burke was, as communiques about her were going back and forth from Clare to Dublin from late 1920. On January the 18th, 1921, and I'll move on to the, oh yes, 1921, another communique went to GHQ, and it was noted that it is essential that you send us at once a full report on any circumstances relating to her family, connections locally, etc. So here was a request that the Burke family be put under surveillance. Between January and July 1921, and while Burke was being detained by the West Clare Brigade, there is much correspondence about her in the Collins papers, which are held in the military archives and can be accessed online. She and her family were subject to intense surveillance and intelligence gathering by locals, by Cumann Mon, and by Republicans during these months. By April 1921, the surveillance had uncovered that a Mr. Kelly, who was a frequent visitor to the Burke home, was a black and tan RIC man. The brother of this black and tan man was, according to the report, a Captain Kelly, who was an intelligence officer in Cork and one of the torturers of IRA man Tom Hales. The commander of the Cork 3rd Brigade, Hales, had been arrested in Bandon by the British Crown forces. He'd been interrogated and tortured so badly that his mouth and hands had been severely damaged. Captain Kelly and his intelligence colleagues at Victoria Barracks in Cork were held responsible for torturing Hales and other IRA prisoners, and numerous abortive attempts had been made on Kelly's life. Now the West Clare Brigade had in their sights a young woman associated with Kelly and his brother. Bridie Burke herself, it seems, was a private typist employed in Victoria Barracks by Captain Kelly, where the 1st Southern Division of the IRA in Cork were also watching her. A communique from them states that Bridie Burke was taken into custody in West Clare, and it said they noted She has the devil's own fine story and any amount of wonderful ways of explaining a possible connection with Captain Kelly. So obviously she was trying to explain her position and get out of any trouble she was in. While in custody, she wrote a long and complicated narrative of how she came to be associated with the Kelly family, at all times trying to construct herself as an innocent party, who just happened to know Captain Kelly. Her letter attempted to position her actions of those of a kind of an innocent abroad. She had attended, she wrote, Colton's Academy in Cork, qualified as a typist in June 1920, and sent her application to the military barracks for work. As at the time, she wrote, I did not much mind where I made a start. And again, you have to remember, she's actually putting in an application for work in the military barracks in Cork while the War of Independence is at its height. So she isn't very much an innocent abroad here. She must have had some realization of what was going on around her. Her explanation for her acquaintance with Kelly was a complicated narrative of association through her brother, who was a medical student in Cork, who knew a nurse, who knew Mrs. Kelly, the mother of Captain Kelly and Lieutenant Kelly from Kildysart. The brother couldn't visit because he was a black and tan man, so asked Bridie to visit Mrs. Kelly. And she said, on our arrival to Kildysart, we were thrown out. We did not know why until we made inquiries. Again, feigning innocence here. Mrs. Kelly was not there, but a letter sent to Constable Kelly invited him to call on the Burkes, which he did. And as reported by Bridie, whenever he came, he was in uniform with a trench coat. This, she wrote, was the only connection between Mrs. Kelly and my people. But Mrs. Kelly was not the issue. It was her son, Constable Kelly, and nobody was taking Bridie's explanation at face value. As the report said, she had this devil's own fine story. But she was very lucky that her detention by the West Clare Brigade coincided with the beginning of the truce, and with a guarantee from her that she would not return to work in Victoria Barracks for Captain Kelly, and in the spirit of the present truce, she was released. On the 25th of July 1921, a note from Dublin Intel to West Clare agreed to her release and further stated that she be told, with regards to her behaviour and association with Captain Kelly, she may thank God she is not a man. If she had been a man, she would have been shot. This surveillance of Bridie Burke, which extended over 8 or 9 months and was undertaken by people in or associated with several brigades of the IRA and the Southern Division Command, was not unusual. Her association with Captain Kelly and her work in Victoria Barracks made her suspect. She was not the only woman that Republican intelligence gatherers kept long-term watch on and about whom they sent detailed notes to GHQ. There were many civilians, men and women, on whom a detailed surveillance was kept. Excuse me, the screen share has come down. I'll put that up again. On whom a detailed surveillance was kept. The women being watched were deemed suspect, insufficient in their loyalty to the Republican cause, and indeed regarded as potential traitors to their fellow countrymen and women. There was also moral judgments being made about these women, not least because many of them were young, travelling around the country alone and meeting men without guardians present. Respectable Irish women did not behave in this manner, and if they did, judgment and punishment was demanded and imposed. However, despite the killing of at least 3 women suspected of spying for the Crown forces, the IRA did not generally kill women suspects. General Order Number 13, issued in 1920 on women spies, ordered that even when guilty, women were not to be executed, as the consideration of her sex prevents the infliction of the statutory punishment of death. Most suspect women were not killed, unlike the numbers of men. 186 spies and informers who, according to Ewan O'Halpin's research, were killed between January 1919 and December 1921. However, that's not to say that the women got off lightly. Other punishments were devised to keep the women and girls compliant, respectable, and behaving as proper Irish women. The military side of the guerrilla war, that of ambushes, assassinations, and attacks on the RIC and military targets, is very important, but so too was the collaboration and compliance active force of the population. Collaboration by women, organised and unorganised, has now been recognised by most historians as central to the successful functioning of a guerrilla army. However, the IRA felt it also had to deal with the defiance or resistance of civilian population, especially those they considered spies or informers who were suspect in their loyalties. Surveillance and intelligence was vital, as was acting on that information. Large-scale surveillance of the population undertaken by the IRA and Republican sympathizers, and the violence was often a consequence of that. As historian Brian Hughes notes, between January 1919 and December 1921, the IRA killed at least 277 civilians, the majority of them executed as spies or informers. But non-lethal violence and coercion was more widespread. And although it is difficult to map this precisely, as Hughes further remarks, these everyday acts of harm and threats did not operate in isolation to the common ambushes and executions, but combined to dictate the atmosphere of violence and fear in an individual community. And I want to look at the gendered aspect of that violence and fear. One of the most successful non-military campaigns of the War of Independence was the boycott of the policing arms of the British state, the RIC and the DMP. A boycott had been mooted as early as 1917, and once the War of Independence broke out, it intensified around the country. RIC men, their families and dependents, and anyone who interacted with or worked for them were to be boycotted. Wives and families were often forcibly ejected, for instance, from barracks accommodation. There was widespread compliance with and support of the boycott, although it varied from area to area throughout the country, while those who resisted were often noted and encouraged by threatening letter, by late night visit, to fall in line with the boycott. This intimidation extended to women suspected of being friendly with the RIC or to barrack servants who worked for the RIC. And I want to look at the barrack servants. In June 1920, in the Michael Collins papers, there's a request from Dingle, from the IRA in Dingle, about what they should do with the RIC barrack servants. What they asked were they to do with the one or two women who cook and wash for them. Are they made to give up their job? And the reply was a terse yes. These barrack servants' jobs were held mainly by older, poor, married women or widow women, to avoid the potential of scandal by having young unmarried women working in an all-male environment. Many were widows or poor working class women. This was often their family's only income, a low-paid but steady and secure income. So coercion and intimidation was used to encourage those resisting the boycott to leave their job. This encouragement included surveillance of their activities, shooting up their homes, or forcibly cutting their hair. For example, the Irish Times reported that a Mary Ryan, a barrack servant at Black Boy Pike Barracks in Limerick, had her house shot up by mass in April 1920. In May 1920, a barrack servant in Clare, County Sligo, received a notice warning her on pain of death not to cook food for the police there. In December 1920, which is the notice that I have there on the slide, the Donegal Democrat reported that Ellen Gillan, a servant in Ballyshannon RIC barracks, alleged that she had been seized by masked men who cut off her hair, beat her severely enough that her lips were bleeding, and told her that she was a traitor to her country and to her religion. Published in 1921, the report of the Labour Commission on Conditions in Ireland recorded that there are a number of cases where women employed in the RIC barracks are attacked. In some cases, women have had their hair cut off. Work done by historian Sean Gannon on barrack servants in Limerick City and County has revealed the frightening threats they received to give up their jobs. For instance, the RIC County Inspector notes that female RIC barrack servants in Limerick are threatened with a woman's doom. And what that means is hard to decipher. A woman's doom possibly doesn't mean death, but probably hair cropping or some type of assault, including sexual assault, if they did not resign their posts. As Gannon points out, IRA intimidation of barrack servants was one of the most significant types of gendered violence during the War of Independence. An example of this type of terror was the threatening letter received by Bridget O'Toole, a barrack servant at Rear Horse Barracks in Tipperary in April 1920, warning her that if she did not give up her job, she would suffer the extreme penalty. The note mentioned that she should remember Finn's eyes are missing, so mind yours. This was a chilling reference to the severe head injuries suffered by Constable William Finn, who had been stationed at Rear Cross and who had been killed by the IRA in an ambush at Lackamore Woods on April the 9th, 1920, and had been very badly damaged around the eyes. Therefore, they were threatening Bridget O'Toole with the same type of injury. Another incident was when Ellen Morris, a Barrack servant in New Palace in Limerick, received a letter in May 1920 threatening her with death if she continued working. The letter, it is reported in RIC summaries of police reports, had the desired effect, as did most of the letters and attacks on Barrack servants. This is just a few of the very many attacks on women Barrack servants, most of which had the desired effect, with the women leaving their place of employment, often placing themselves and their families in deeper want and poverty. While the intimidation of women out of their jobs in the RIC is usually not considered in the histories of what David Fitzpatrick has termed a systemic national crusade against the police, it is important to note this was a specific and gendered targeting of women workers. Without these domestic servants working for them, the surveillance intimidation of Barrack servants had the desired effect of making the work of the RIC much harder. Along with a refusal to engage with or supply the barracks, the fact that the general domestic work in the barracks, the cooking and the cleaning, etc., washing of clothes, taking care of their uniforms, had now to be undertaken by the policemen themselves, impacting on their ability to function effectively in communities. Not only were Barrack servants under constant surveillance and threat by Republicans, however, so too were younger women, those who were considered to have suspect associations with the police and military. So for the rest of this paper and for the rest of our time together, I want to spend some time unpacking the type of surveillance and threat which women and teenage girls received from Republicans in 1920 and 1921, and its impact and legacies on Irish women's position in society post the setting up of the Irish Free State. In February 1921, a letter was sent from the Tipperary 3rd Brigade asking what it would do. Would you please advise to have done to girls, some of whom have brothers in the IRA, keeping company with black and tans. We have several cases of this kind in the area. I'd like advice on the matter before we take action. The reply came from Dublin on March 5th, 1921. It said, I suggest the remedy is that the brothers should give notice immediately when the girls went out, and consequently a suitable opportunity be found for dealing with the black and tans themselves. The directive here is that the brother keep watch on, and by implication control of, their sisters, their suspected association with Crown forces, and that opportunities be taken to deal with the men they were supposedly meeting. We know from multiple sources that it's not only brothers who kept watch on their sisters. Young women were under surveillance from many members of their communities, and reports on their behaviours were delivered to local Republicans, to Cumann na mBan branches, to Sinn Féin branches, to IRA units. In just one of the many files in the Collins papers, one which contains reports prepared by brigade intelligence officers in counties Cork, Limerick, Kerry and Waterford, there are over 400 reports which deal with civilians accused of associating with or giving information to the members of the Crown forces. Of these, 120 specifically detail the activities of women. The surveillance reveals a number of areas in which civilians could be considered suspect. Both men and women who reported any incidences to RIC barracks or who gave evidence in courts of inquiry were reported. Engagements or associations with police on any matters, social, economical, or ideological, were to be discouraged. For instance, RIC pensioners or ex-soldiers socialising with police were monitored and often reported and threatened. For women, however, the charge of company keeping, that is, keeping company with Crown forces, appears again and again. As the historian of the Black and Tans, C.M. Leeson, has written, women who kept company with the police were liable to suffer threats or violence or both. Company keeping could be anything from being seen talking to a policeman or a soldier, to actually walking out with these men, to being in a relationship or an RIC constable, as happened here to Miss Anne Devine in May 1920 in Cushlock near Tuam. Devine, as the newspapers reported, was found to have received a letter from a constable, Edward Daly, a native of her neighbourhood, who had joined the Black and Tans 2 years ago and with whom she was intimate prior to his leaving the district. For this offence, Devine's hair was hacked off with a cutting shears in front of her horrified grandmother. And one thing I want to say about the Anne Devine case, Ed Daly was her neighbour before he actually joined the Black and Tan. So he was an Irishman, a Catholic Irishman from the locality in Tuam, and he was stationed in Cork. And the letter from Anne Devine was found when the IRA had raided the mail train in Cork and read off all the letters, and obviously then passed that information on to the IRA in Galway. And then Anne Devine's home was attacked late at night, one night, by armed and masked men, and they intruded to hack off Anne Devine's hair. Similar to the Bridie Perk case, their association with Crown Forces by two sisters from Tipperary town, which I want to talk about now, brought them to the attention of the intelligence gathering Republican network that crossed Ireland and into the UK. So May and Kathleen Falvey from Tipperary town are a very interesting case. They're two girls that are obviously in boarding school or in convent school in England, but some girls in England had reported them for getting letters to the school, to the local IRA in Tipperary. And a report sent from GHQ to the adjutant of the 2nd Southern Command contains reporting on the intelligence situation in Limerick, Kerry and Tipperary. There are 15 items in this report that deal with the execution of a male spy in Limerick, and then item 11 deals with two girls living in a convent in Cadogan Square in London. These were May and Kathleen Falvey of Thurles, County Tipperary, the daughter of Michael Falvey, a serving RIC officer, and his wife Mary. Looking at the 1911 census, this is an Irish Catholic family. He had been in the RIC. He had rejoined once the war broke out, and one of his sons was a Black and Tan. Membership of the RIC would immediately make the Falvey family suspect, but the detail and language used in the intel report on the two girls, the daughters, is interesting. It details how certain other girls in the convent were suspicious of the two girls in question and made a search of their rooms in which a number of letters from auxiliaries were found. Reports back and forth detailed the holidays of May and Kathleen to Limerick, or to Tipperary rather, where May was noted to be keeping company with a Black and Tanned named Besant. Besant, it says, record is a bad one, and Kathleen was also sometimes to be seen in the company of Black and Tans. Their sister Bridie had actually married a Sergeant Reddington, also a Black and Tan. It was also noted in the report that neither of them was in the position to have sufficient money to be running constantly backward and forward to Ireland, and it's therefore assumed that this money comes from other sources, again implying that they are selling information. We know that their father was hostile to the IRA and their brother was a Black and Tan in Limerick. Letters they sent to auxiliary members were steamed open and reported on. A letter from her father to Kathleen advised her to ignore the threatening letters she and May were obviously getting and keep doing their work. All the intelligence reports on the Falveys indicate a family whose loyalist politics were firm, with the daughters reporting on any Republicans they knew of. Unlike reports on the men of the Falvey and men in general, there's also a sense here in these intelligence gathering reports that moral judgments were being passed on the sisters and their company keeping. What were they getting? Where were they getting the money for their lifestyle was very much part of the questioning going on here. And this was as important as the information they were sharing. They were deviant girls. Even the fact that they moved to the UK did not stop the surveillance. In September 1921, well into the truce period, a report in the Collins papers said that their present address is somewhere in Chelsea. We expect to get a name and number of the street soon. The Falveys actually did escape any other sanction, but many other women were exposed to serious gendered violence for perceived immoral and disloyal behaviours. For example, a Miss Kearns, a post office assistant in Kilmare, County Kerry, and her companion, Lieutenant Coleman, an enemy intelligence officer, were watched very closely. It was noted that Coleman, usually went down to Kilmare to meet her on Saturday evenings and often stayed until Monday morning, implying illicit sexual activity. There were, the report says, about a dozen witnesses who could prove the charge against Miss Kearns. The offences in the majority of the 120 women in these intelligence files of the 4 counties on the Western Seaboard were accused of was forming personal relationships with Crown Forces, would keep in company with Black and Tans. How Republicans dealt with these reports varied. Many women and girls received verbal warning or threatening letters, like the Falveys. More received threatening letters and were physically assaulted. Others were warned repeatedly to stay away from the military, and if they did not heed those warnings, as happened with several girls in Milltown Malbay in Clare in April 1920, they were sanctioned, and that was the word used, sanctioned by having their hair bobbed. The newspaper reported that these girls are now wearing wigs. In Lismore, County Waterford in autumn 1920, Nina Wright, for instance, was sent several threatening letters warning her of her behaviour. She was seen in the company of a black and tans, and when she didn't stop, had her hair bobbed. Also happened to Kate Kelly in Longford and Julia Kenny in Wicklow. Another interesting example detailed in the intelligence files I mentioned is the case of Bridley Flynn, or Feehan in Headford, County Kerry, who was under surveillance by the IRA. They suspected she was a lady searcher, and lady searchers were employed by the Black and Tans to search women who had been arrested or were suspected of Republican sympathies. She was keeping company with an RIC constable, James Woods, who was stationed in Farnfor RIC barracks. Surveillance of Feehan noted where and when she met Woods, a Black and Tan regarded as particularly aggressive towards Republicans. On November 9, 1920, when Woods was returning by train from Killarney to Farnfor, he and another constable, Archibald Turner, were pulled off the train at Ballybrack station and shot dead by members of the Fireys Battalion of the IRA. Turner died instantly and Woods died a few days later. The report on Feehan includes the note that Woods was on the train that day because he was returning from Killarney, where he had kept an appointment with that young lady. Surveillance of Feehan had provided the Fireys IRA the opportunity to get a Black and Tan who they considered a real danger to their operations. Woods, however, continued to be under surveillance. It did not end with the killing Feehan continued to be under surveillance. It did not end with the killing of Woods. Her behaviour, her company keeping, like that of so many other women, had to be punished. Not just by the fact that, her partner, her boyfriend, was now shot dead. In January 1920, she had been bobbed by the IRA. They noted that she was middle-sized, good-looking, and wore a yellow wig because she had been bobbed by the IRA in January for going with the enemy. Hair bobbing, shaving, cropping was the contemporary terms used for the forcible hair cutting, often accompanied by extreme violence that women and girls experienced during the War of Independence, mainly from the spring of 1920 to the summer of 1921, with small spikes in the spring and summer of 1922. So far, my research through multiple sources, archives, etc., has uncovered over 230 individual instances of forcible hair cropping of women between late 1919 into the summer of 1922, the majority of it happening autumn 1920 into the spring, summer of 1921. And the majority of this hair cropping was done by Republicans. That's not to say some was done by the Crown Forces. It was. We have instances of members of Cumann na mBan being hair cropped, but the majority of the hair cropping done on women in Ireland during the War of Independence was done by Republicans, and the numbers bear this out. There is no doubt, however, that forcible hair cropping was used as a major weapon of coercive control by Republicans who wished to prevent their women from forming personal relationship with the Crown Forces. And additionally, it was not, as many have presumed, a hidden aspect of violence against women during this time. Dozens of cases, or outrages, as they were more commonly termed, are reported in newspapers. And this is where I get a lot of the detail of these cases, both national and local, and indeed international. One of the most famous cases was the case of Bridget Keegan in Tuam, County Galway, and that was reported in at least 15, up to 20 newspapers nationally and internationally. She was attacked, assaulted, and had her hair cropped by armed and masked men late on the night of April the 30th, 1920. As many newspapers reported, the men took her out of the house while clad only in her nightdress, cut off her hair with his shears, and that was, they told her, what she got for going with Tommies. 4 local men were subsequently arrested, tried, and found guilty of this outrage. The Keegan outrage and the subsequent trial was reported in almost every local, national and local newspaper, as well as in British newspapers such as the Manchester Guardian and further afield in American and Australian newspapers. So people were reading this every day as they were reporting in the newspapers. They knew that women would be hair cropped, that the actual hair cropping created terror, but also the potential for hair cropping created terror. In 1920 and 21, forcible hair cropping of women for company keeping were regular occurrences. It was open and common knowledge that these were the punishments that would be inflicted on women who were considered disloyal or engaged in punishments. In Tralee, for example, in 1920, a poster went up on Ash Street warning girls under severe penalty from association with police. Public notices appeared in Cork, where it was stated that any girls speaking to police from this forward would be liable for the penalty of the haircut. And they didn't mean a nice haircut. While a similar notice in Galway added girls would have their hair cropped and their ears amputated. Now, this didn't happen, but many girls in Galway did get their hair cropped. Many young women were seen to be company keeping or suspected of the same, were subject to the various controls, receiving the warning letter, the threatening letter, being physically assaulted prior to their hair cropping. For example, in August 1920 in Newcastle West in County Limerick, a local teacher, Annie O'Leary, was attacked and had her hair cropped for being friendly with the police. She did receive £400 compensation for this outrage, according to reports in the Irish Times and Irish Independent. Some cases show the very specifically gendered nature of these attacks. The Sullivan home outside Listowel in County Kerry was attacked in October 1920. The son of the house, Daniel, was beaten with stones and sticks for attempting to join the RIC, but the masked raiders cut off the hair of his sister's head as she was on friendly terms with the police. So they beat the son of the house for attempting to join the RIC, but they cropped her hair. And you see here the very specific gendered punishments and the moral judgment that is being passed on the girl. This attack was reported in the Irish Times, the Kerry People, and the Skibbereen Eagle newspapers. While most hair cropping attacks happened in Munster and on the western seaboard of Clare and Galway, there is no county in which a few did not occur. Returning to the attack on Anne Devine in 1920, it is reported in the newspapers that the masked men cropped her hair. One of them said to her, "We will make Irish girls have nothing to do with Ireland's foreign enemies." As Louise Ryan has written, women were defined through their relationships with the enemy, as spies or as a girlfriend, and these relationships made these women as shameful, as deviant, as immoral, as lacking of the most necessary of markers of Irish femininity, respectability. This possessive and coercive attitude towards women is reflected in several statements by men to the Bureau, subsequently to the Bureau of Military History. As James Maloney of the Brough Volunteers in County Limerick later noted, some girls created a problem. The British uniform was an attraction for them, as indeed would any uniform. They could be a real danger to the movement and gave a bad example by consorting with the enemy. They were warned repeatedly and stronger measures had to be resorted to. No volunteer liked the job, but on occasions, these girls' hair had to be cut. And you see this is something we had to do. Here we have what we understand in contemporary terms really is victim blaming. The women and girls were considered the problem. They were the perpetrators of misdeeds which had to be punished so that proper republican order could be restored. Women and girls who consorted with the enemy were, as those who were attacked and cropped the tondeuses in France, the Shorn women in 1945 France and Belgium, were not only morally loose, but also traitorous, and as potential informers, a threat to the existence of the nation. Along with the potential that the women might be informers, there was also strong suspicions that their behaviour revealed uncontrolled deviant female sexuality, impure behaviours which concerned the men who carried out these attacks. As T.K. Wilson writes, the issue of hair cutting might be seen as a sexualised punishment in that it deliberately targeted the femininity of the usually Catholic women who were held to have betrayed their national responsibilities, not just Republican, but national responsibilities, their moral standing, their respectability. Republican men, therefore, undertook the hard but necessary work, as they saw it, of punishing and publicly shaming these deviant, immoral women and girls. This work was seen as essential to reinforcing the conservative values, morals, and ideals of respectable Irish women. values which would come to dominate the discourse of women's place in the Irish Free State. Surveillance of women and their behaviours and punishments, such as forcible hair cropping, was Republicans' ways of reinforcing their position as protectors of the future and of imposing control over the behaviour of their women, and fortifying the purity of the imagined nation for which they were fighting. With the guilty women girl shamed, her sins obvious on her shorn head, as Leo Buckley, the intelligence officer of the Cork No. 1 Brigade, later said, the appearance of the girl with bobbed hair clearly denoted her way of life. With her name in the newspaper, her repentance or ostracization assured, Republican men could uphold and defend the community they claimed to protect and reinforce their own hegemonic masculinity, authority, and leadership in whatever new state came into being. Furthermore, as Maria Luddy has written, the state that was achieved post-revolution, the Irish Free State, was one in which women would continue to be seen as central to how immorality could harm society, a state where the coercive control of women's behaviours, femininities, and bodies would be central to the discourse of respectability, of moral and pure Irish Catholic womanhood, and one where women and girls would continue to be surveilled, shamed, and stigmatised for decades more. Thank you very much. I'll stop share. And any questions?
Thank you so much, Mary, for that fascinating, if somewhat harrowing presentation. We have one question in here. Do we know if any of the IRA men involved in these hair cuttings ever expressed remorse in later life for these and other actions directed against women? Did any of them detail these accounts in BMH statements or in military pension applications or elsewhere as proof of their devotion to the Republican cause?
They did. That's where we get some of the detail. Not a lot of them talk about it, but yes, certainly some of them talk about it in the Bureau of Military History. Leo Buckley, whom I quoted, spoke about how this was a necessary job that the men felt they had to undertake. In the pension files, not a lot of them talk about having to do this work, but yes, you do find some of them are talking about the fact that they had to. They felt, it was a thing. It was part of what they were doing as Republicans in creating this new state they wanted to bring into being. It was part of also being, the counter state. Interestingly, which I haven't touched on, is that some of these women did not report the attacks to the RIC because they were discouraged from doing so. That was seen as further evidence of their engagement with the RIC, because of course at this stage the counter state was operating and you had Republican courts and that sort of thing. But I have come across no evidence that any men were taken to these Republican courts for attacks on women, hair cropping, for company keeping. There were men taken to the Republican courts for indecent assault on women, not connected with any coercive control, but not for this hair cropping. No, this was seen as something that was a hard job, but it was a necessary job.
Wow, interesting. Another question here from Sinead. You mentioned that the vast majority of instances of hair cropping was conducted by the nationalists. Is this true for the total number of all forms of attacks against women during the War of Independence by both sides, or is it specific to hair cropping?
No, it's true of almost all, other than indecent assault and rape, which we don't have a huge amount of evidence of that on either side. The absence of evidence doesn't mean it wasn't happening, because of course a lot of this wasn't being reported. But physical assaults, hair cropping, threatening letters, ostracization, that was mainly being undertaken by the Republicans as part of their coercive control, not just of women, but of civilian population generally. But, these gendered attacks were very much being done by the Republicans. There was a lot of attacks on women by the Crown Forces, particularly during the raids and reprisals. And that was happening around the country as well. Don't get me wrong. It was 6 of one and half a dozen of another in terms of raids on homes, but gendered violence, the Republicans were very much doing more than the Crown Forces were doing, yes.
Wow. A couple of thank yous, and that was fantastic. Thank you, Dr. McAuliffe. What attitude, Jack Montgomery wants to know, what attitude did Cumann na mBan have to these punishments?
Interestingly, when you're reading Cumann na mBan, obviously the Cumann na mBan women were targeted, and oftentimes the Cumann na mBan women who were attacked and aircropped were targeted because a woman who would be considered one of ours by the Crown Forces had been attacked by the IRA. So, for example, in Galway in September 1920, 4 or 5 women were hair cropped who were members of Cumann na mBan or associated with Cumann na mBan because a young woman had been hair cropped earlier in the day who had given evidence at a court of inquiry on the killing of an RIC constable. Same thing happened in Lixnaw in County Kerry, and you've incidences of that around the country where Cumann na mBan are targeted. In many ways, the Cumann na mBan women don't get hair cropped as much, but they get violently beaten up by the Crown Forces when they are and deliberately targeted because they are members of Cumann na mBan and their houses burnt down around them. So there's a different type of violence being perpetrated on the Cumann na mBan women by the Crown Forces. It does include the hair cropping, and there are some incidences of sexual violence against them, but mainly it is physical assault and burning them out of their homes and creating an atmosphere of terror in which they live, hoping that obviously that will stop them participating as members of Cumann na mBan. In terms of how Cumann na mBan viewed these women that were being attacked for company keeping, I would think the majority of the surveillance was being done by the Cumann na mBan women on the other women, and that information was being fed to the IRA because they, we have to understand society at this time is a very homosocial society. So men and women spent a lot of time apart. So it would be the women watching the other young women and keeping an eye on them, not all. Now, for example, in the Bridget Keegan case, she was seen by the 4 men who attacked her speaking to a policeman at a fair in Tuam, and that's why she was attacked. But a lot of the information was coming from the Cumann na mBan women about the company keeping.
Great. David Ryan says, great talk. Was curious if the treatment of women by both Republicans and Crown Forces had an impact on opposition to the treaty by female TDs.
This is something I'm thinking about. That's a very good question, because when you look at the military pension applications of the Cumann na mBan women and you see the suffering that they went through and what they put themselves through to fight for what they consider, the 32 country republic that had been declared in 1916, you can see why they were so intransigent, because they couldn't go on the run. They were the ones who were on the front line. So the domestic space had become a space of terror. So they were attacked in their homes burnt down. They talk about constant raiding. There was a Julia Duffy, I recall, when I read her statement again and again, I come back to it and I think she was so prosaic about saying she was beaten up one night and 9 teeth were beaten out of her mouth. And I mean, you have to think of the violence that 9 of your teeth would be broken. That's how violent some of the physical assaults these Cumann na mBan women were suffering. And that's apart from, some sexualized assaults we know about and the hair cropping they suffered. So that terror they endured certainly would seem to me to have hardened them against any compromise when it came to the treaty. On top of everything else, the executions in 1916, the promises of the proclamation, which they all clung to as well.
Yeah. Dom is wondering, do you know of any instance, many of your examples are based in the Republic, do you know of any instance in the North of violence?
Yeah, there is actually quite an outbreak of violence in the summer of 1922, spring and summer of 1922, obviously just before the Civil War breaks out in the South, where everything is up in the air around the border, and what is happening there, and the Belfast violence. The violence has started in the cities, and you see a lot of young women are being hair cropped. Now, interestingly, sometimes it's now happening as when it's criminals intruding on houses, committing robbery. They also hair crop the girls in the house, and it's happening. The B specials are doing it, the Republicans are doing it, and the RUC are doing it. So we do have a lot of examples. And actually, a piece I wrote some time ago that will be published in this new Royal Irish Academy book that's coming out details those attacks that happened in Northern Ireland. There's quite a few attacks during the War of Independence in Donegal as well, and in the border counties, but mostly they're happening during the War of Independence in Munster.
Wow, amazing. A couple of questions here that have already been answered. Again, thank yous and excellent talk. Paul J. Dalton says, thank you for a wonderful talk, Mary. It's great to shine a light on a part of the war not talked about enough. Was there a similar policy of reprisal against women carried on during the Civil War? And as a follow-up to that, once the Civil War finished, was there a lasting stigma on these women?
Yes, you don't get as much hair cropping, in fact, very little during the Civil War, but what you get is a targeting by the Free State and the National Army of what they call diehards, the militant women. And, one example I could give you is that maybe less than 100 women were imprisoned during the War of Independence, probably about 60. Upwards of 600 were imprisoned by the Free State government and the National Army during the Civil War, because they knew what the women could do. And since Cumann were, for the most part, anti-treaty, they started putting them in prison. But there is a lot of physical assaults on women who are involved in anti-treaty activities, and we know that from reports in newspapers. There's also a real demeaning and diminishing of these women, and it begins that whole idea that these women are diehards, they're furies, they're unmanageable, ungovernable revolutionaries. And then the second half of your question, it does feed into the idea that women need to be controlled in the Free State. Now, the Free State that was set up was never going to be a radical state when it came to women's rights at all. But the fact that many of the Cumann women were seen as blooded, as bloodthirsty, and needed to be re-feminized, put back into the domestic, certainly feeds into that discourse of controlling women, and feeds into the Irish Free State's attitude, combined obviously with the church's attitude to women, that they should be respectable. Respectability becomes the defining discourse, and Cumann militants in the Civil War are not seen as respectable. They're diehards, they're furies, they're crazy. So it does have an impact.
Wow. Barbara Bergen is wondering, is there much evidence of Cumann members taking part in surveillance themselves and information gathering on women for company keeping, etc.?
Yeah, a lot of these notes that were sent that are in the Collins files are not signed, but we know anecdotally and we know from other sources that yes, Cumann women were keeping surveillance, but of course it would have been part of their job as well to make sure that local communities were fully behind the Republican cause, and if anyone was seen to be suspect in their loyalties, and that included company keeping, well, then they would have to be exposed and treated as the enemy. But the Cumann women also were reporting on what the Crown Forces were doing, both to themselves and to the civilian community. So we can see that in the Irish Bulletin, which really it was the Cumann women who kept that going and were doing a lot of reporting, including women, women who had been suffrage women like Meg Connery, reporting on the war on women, and that's what they called it. So they're reporting on all sorts of what is going on, and they have such a powerful part to play in this revolutionary war that's not just about helping the IRA win the war or carry out the war, but also on surveillance, on propaganda, on all sorts of things that they were doing in this period.
Interesting. Joe, I think you've kind of answered this, but was the attitude the same on women keeping company with British soldiers? I think you've kind of,
yeah. And actually, a lot of the time, the surveillance it led to attacks on these British soldiers or RIC, any military, any member of the Crown Forces were considered fair game. And so they'd watch the women and then they would launch an attack. And a few women were actually killed. And Elizabeth Scales in Limerick, who was talking to an RIC constable after she had come out of mass one morning, and he was attacked. He got away and she died in the attack. So when they were watching the women, they then would launch an assault to kill, you know, one of those assassination attempts. And sometimes the women were wounded or killed.
Wow. Sharon wants to know, did the IRA take the hair cropping punishment from another country, or did the French take that punishment from what they've seen here?
Well, I think, you know, we have to, it was not an Irish thing. You also have to remember that, you know, hair cropping was occurring in other facets of Irish society at this time. The Magdalen laundries were open then. They were women being put in there and they were being hair cropped once they were put in. Hair cropping of deviant women or deviant men, indeed, that was happening in jail was quite common. But to do it openly and to do it for a specific reason during the War of Independence was something that the Irish, they wouldn't have taken an example from the French because that happened later, but it is something that is a globally accepted way of shaming and stigmatizing women from the 19th into the 20th century. And we see it in many wars. I was just using the French example because that's the most well known, but it happens in many countries, in many wars.
Wow. Is there any evidence of women being involved in these assaults, or was it always men?
A few. There was one in Dublin where the report is that a group of men with a woman attacked a woman, and the woman who was the one who did the hair cropping, but very few. You know, there's a few others down the country where you seems to imply that there was a woman among the attackers, but mostly it's armed and masked men.
Right.
That's what they talk about, yeah.
Right. Grace wants to know, do we know if surveillance of particular individuals continued after these instances of hair cropping to ensure their compliance?
Yes, it did. As you saw from the Falvey case, for example, the girls were continued to be under surveillance well into the truce, and then it peters off. Also, they would be very much marked. I mean, it was going to take a long time for their hair to grow back. And sometimes they left the neighborhood. What I'm trying to do now with a lot of the cases where I know the names and know where they were from is try and follow their future lives and see what happened, these young women, both the women who were hair cropped for company keeping, but also the coming among women, and what, you know, how that impacted on their later life, if it did, which I would imagine, you know, the trauma and terror of that would have impacted on them in their later life. And the concept of respectability becomes such a powerful discourse in Irish society from the beginning of the Irish Free State, that the memory of those girls being hair cropped in a neighborhood, how is that impacting on their standing in that neighborhood? Because the memory will still be there. It would have been in the newspapers. Everybody would have known. I'm very interested then in how this played out in memory and in their standing in the community, if they stayed in those communities subsequently on into the early decades of the Irish Free State.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Noel Roach says, most interesting and painful side of the history, many thanks. And how were these women treated by the local community, etc., after 1922? We've kind of touched on that a bit, but
it's interesting when you read, some of them did go to the police and complain, and then there would be a court case if they or they would sue for compensation, or sometimes the perpetrators would be known. So we have the names of some of the perpetrators. The Jordan brothers were the ones who cut off Bridget Keegan's hair. But if you read the reports in the newspapers of the court cases, it's almost like it's a comedy. the young woman is often held up to disdain and laughter in the court. Well, aren't you fine now? Your hair has grown again, because the court cases might be 8 months to a year later. And it's almost like this isn't being taken seriously. You got what you deserved. It was wrong what they did, and the men would be found guilty and given maybe 6 months hard labor, or the woman would get some compensation. But the shaming continued in the language used in the court cases. And that's very hard to read as well, when you consider modern court cases of how victim blaming still goes on.
Yeah, God. Alison Bowen makes the point that Republicans continued the beatings and assaults on women suspected of having contact with the British forces or other enemies during the Troubles in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah. Well, it's an effective weapon, so.
Yeah. Ali wants to know, did the surveillance include photograph taking of the women?
No. There is one British pathé film of Meg Keneally, and I think that was the photo I showed at the end, a still from it. That is about 10 seconds. She was hair cropped in 1920 in Limerick City for being friendly with the police. There is 1 or 2 photographs that I know of an exhibition in Galway Museum. One of the girls who was hair cropped by the Crown Forces that night I spoke about, where 4 or 5 of them were hair cropped in retaliation. If you go online to Galway Museum, there is a very faded image. Her family obviously took a photo of her. And in many ways, the Cumann na mBan women didn't have that shameful and stigmatizing experience. They could wear their hair cropped hair with pride, because this was their suffering for their involvement as part of the Republican movement. So the photograph is on the Galway Museum website, that exhibition. And then I have a few photographs in later life of the women who were hair cropped from Cumann na mBan. But generally, there's only that one photograph of Meg Keneally, who was hair cropped by Republicans in 1920 in Limerick. And it happened that there must have been a film crew from British Pathé. But it's hard to look at that, even though it's only 10 seconds, because you can see a male hand holding her and making her face this way and that way. And she looks very uncomfortable, even though she smiles at one stage, but she looks really uncomfortable, and it makes for uncomfortable viewing.
Yes, yeah, of course. Emer Burke says, thanks for a great talk. Can you mention the sources that you used to ascertain the Crown Force violence against Cumann na mBan women, especially in Dublin?
Newspaper articles, obviously, the Bureau of Military History, the military services, or the military pension application files, just the Crown Forces, that would be the main ones. Newspapers are a great source. And many of those are online. For the hair cropping of women generally, the RIC reports, the Collins papers, as I mentioned, are very detailed source. And then you have memoirs, histories, diaries. Lil Conlon, for example, who talks about hair cropping of Cumann na mBan, wrote her memoir in the 1960s, and many others mention it in passing in their memoirs. So you just have to do that broad search through all the archival and memoir and diary sources to build up a sort of a detailed picture of what is going on at this time.
Great. We're running out of time, unfortunately. I'm going to do one more quick question, because I want to know the answer. Did Collins or Dev ever apologise or acknowledge these attacks on women?
Well, Collins, of course, is dead before the end of the Civil War. So no, and obviously he is doing some of the responding to the requests for surveillance on women, so he knows this is going on. It's part and parcel of making sure there's a compliant civilian population that is behind the Republican fight. Dev, I don't think so. They wouldn't be asked to apologise. Why would they? These women are considered potentially traitors to the Republican cause. They wouldn't have looked for an apology. They just had to get on with their lives as best they could. Annie Devine, for example, had been born in America, and I know she went back to America, and I wonder what happened to her afterwards. So there was no apology. And even for the Cumann na mBan women, there was no apology from the Crown Forces either, from the British state, for the violence, not just hair cropping, but the real physical and sometimes in sexual violence visited on them.
Just a final one before we finish, Dom, and I'm sure lots of us want to know, when is your book available?
Well, that's how long is a piece of string. I am in the process of writing, so I would hope by autumn 22, certainly then.
Great.
Yes.
Well, good luck with the rest of your writing.
Thank you very much. Yes.
We can't wait to read it.
All the questions.
I'm sorry that we have to, there are a few more questions, a lot of really lovely responses saying, great, thank you, well done, excellent talk. But we really do have to finish up, unfortunately. I would like to thank Mary and everyone who took part in today's Dublin Festival of History event run by Dublin City Council. And I hope that you enjoyed today's event, and we're almost at the end of the festival now, just one more event this evening, but hope that you enjoyed all of your events. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mary, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.